Good afternoon, all. Hope this is working. After a little hiccup there, if I do a quick cut, and you can hopefully see me very shortly. Sorry, we had a little YouTube hiccup at the start there. I'm just waiting for the stream to switch over so you can see my face before introducing the rest of the team to today's meeting. Joining me again this week will be Dick Crabb and Tom White, and hopefully we have a very good class for you. Stream's going very, very slow, but let's start and do our hellos. Hello, Tom. How are you doing this week?
Fantastic, Dom. Very much looking forward to talking about some quite interesting subjects this week. I think we're going to recap on some of the subjects we might need to go into some more detail, and we're going to go through 4 or 5 things, and it'll be fantastic.
That's brilliant. And introducing Dick, who has pulled Tom and I up on these subjects that we may have crashed through too quickly. So hello, Dick. How are you doing?
Hello, everybody. I'm very, very well. Thank you very much. And this week I've been going back over all of the past 11 now episodes of CAD Lessons. And I'm producing a sort of index, as it were, of everything that has been talked about, which we will publish somewhere, not quite sure where yet. But as a part of that, I came across various bits and pieces that we variously had said, we'll run out of time this week, but we'll cover that in another episode. So this is the episode we're going to cover an awful lot. It'll be a bit jumbled, but hopefully there'll be it'll fill in some gaps.
Absolutely brilliant. And I think I should just give the subjects out. And if anyone has other subjects we might have skipped over would like us to go back on, please do shout and let us know through whatever channels you can find us on. LinkedIn is most probably the easiest one. The subjects we're going to look at this week are stretching and scaling, hatches, and I think we'll talk about fills within that because I think people might not be too sure about that. Dynamic blocks we'll look at again. Amending blocks in multiple instances, and 3D solids and 3D meshes. And Tom has kindly decided to take most of this on this week. We left reporting out of this. Reporting is one of the other subjects, and I think we'll all spend a bit of time getting reporting together, and we'll talk to you about reporting maybe next week. So that's one for your list, Dick. We're going to talk about reporting next week, so you can keep us in line. So handing over to Tom, and Tom grabbing control.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dom. So we're going to talk about stretching or scaling. Okay, so I have on my screen, which hopefully you can see, I've got 2 polylines, and how I made those polylines, I use the rectangle command. So the rectangle command is a closed polyline. We have produced a square on the left because it's 2 equal measurements, and a rectangle on the right. And so in this circumstance, I drew a 1 meter square, 1 meter by 1 meter square, and then a 2 meter by 1 meter rectangle. But I suppose there was no reason in this circumstance because I knew what those measurements were, so I could draw it with the rectangle command. But could you do it in a different way? So, for example, we were to draw a 1 meter by 1 meter box, and the client asked me, could you increase that by 500 millimeters? So if there's a opportunity to that original document won't be used again, I can, instead of drawing it, so I could use the rectangle command, and in that circumstance, I know that they desire for it to be 1500 by 1 meter because the client asked it to be 500 millimeters bigger. But if it's a more unusual measurement or multiple different increments, could you actually stretch it? Or I suppose scale it, but in this circumstance, I'm going to stretch it. I'm going to temporarily delete these objects, and so you can now see what we now know is a 1 meter by 1 meter square on the page. I'm going to use this stretch command, which I've selected S for stretch, or type in stretch, and it's going to be in the modify toolbar up here, and it's going to look like this. So it's the stretch command. Whenever you hover over any of the commands in the ribbon, it will give you a quick description of what it is. So if you hover over it for a moment or two, it'll tell you what it is. But if you just leave the mouse there or the cursor there, it'll give you a visual representation of what Autodesk believe they've designed the command for. So in this circumstance, I'm going to use the stretch command, and I'm going to select the right-hand side of this polyline, and I'm going to click enter. And it's asking me, so I've now selected the right-hand side. So the right-hand side in my mind is the top right-hand node and the bottom right-hand node. So in my opinion, only this right-hand side is going to move. it's asking me where the base point is. Because in this circumstance, I'm just going to stretch it to the right-hand side, and I have my angles set, or my polar tracking set, that it will lock to horizontal movement. So I'm going to select a random base point, and in this circumstance, I'm going to go further than I desire. So it's relatively unusual that you could put, because we don't have anything to reference this, it would be relatively unusual that you would just drag it and place it wherever. It's more likely that you're going to put a measurement in. So in this circumstance, I'm just going to put 500 millimeters in, enter. I suppose there's another scenario where a stretch command is more useful, because in this circumstance, people might be aware that, sorry, again, I'm going to do the rectangle command. I'm going to click on the top left-hand corner. I'm going to do D for dimension, enter, 1000, enter, 1000, enter. I have my original rectangle, and so a rectangle command is a closed polyline. So another way of doing exactly the same thing would be using the polyline command, 1000 by 1000 by 1000, and rather than doing another 1000, you do C for close, and so we now have two ways of producing the same object, just out of in case it's useful. So I'm going to erase that first object. So this is a rectangle, but it's deemed as a closed polyline. So if you click on it and you look at the properties on the top right hand side, it's not called a rectangle, it's called a polyline, and you go all the way to the bottom, it's asking whether it's closed or not, and it is closed, so it's a closed polyline. And as a consequence, it has these nodes, or Don, what would you call these? Are they nodes? Would you deem it as a node or handle?
Handle, I'd most probably call it, because it's going to allow you to do something. So
in this circumstance, because it's a closed polyline, my handle is giving me a few options, and the option in this circumstance is stretch. So it's the same command, but just doing it in a slightly different way. So in this circumstance, I can stretch it, and the same, I can do 500 millimeters. A scenario where that wouldn't necessarily work is maybe I'm going to edit this. I'll talk through how I've edited it in this in a second, but I'm going to edit this, and I'm still going to produce a closed polyline. I'm going to use the boundary command. So I've still got a closed polyline, but this will be, even though it's a closed polyline, if I decide to pull these Mickey ears to the right slightly, I wouldn't necessarily be able to do it in this circumstance, because I could stretch it, but it would deform it slightly in comparison to often the stretch command is to keep what you've drawn, but just stretch it away from one another. So in this circumstance, I'm going to use the stretch command over everything I believe is being, I desire to stretch to the right-hand side. I say yes, I click a base point, and I select 500 millimeters. So that's the scenario where the stretch of a polyline can be used in two different circumstances. I don't know if you would agree with that, John.
Yep, sorry, just fantastic. Yeah, I was going to say for Dick, I saw Dick's eyes light up there. Do you want to just go through that slightly, showing the boundary command?
Yeah, it's the boundary command. So that's something new, I think.
I saw Dick's face go boom.
Okay, so I have a closed polyline. So we're in agreement. The reason it's closed is because I use the rectangle command, or I use the polyline, and rather than doing the last line, I press C, enter for close. So sorry, if I just do a polyline like so, it can be anything. At the bottom on my command line, there's a few different questions it's asking me, and one of them is a C. So the letter C I'm using because it's highlighted in a blue color, which you might not necessarily see, but when you're using it yourself, the letters you can use rather than writing the whole word will be highlighted in a contrasting color. So in this circumstance, the contrasting color is a dark blue. So C for close. So I have my rectangle here. I'm going to use only the command line to do this, but I'm doing a circle. I can repeat the command by pressing enter, space bar, and I can repeat the radius and or diameter by pressing space bar as well. And I'm going to do one last, but I'm going to do it a smaller diameter. I'm going to use the trim command, and the trim command is getting rid of something. The trim command, Dom, I don't know if you have spent much time on it, but I find that in AutoCAD 2021, there's something different, but I can't put my finger on it. So I don't believe it does exactly the same end result, but I don't feel it's as easy as it was in 2020 for some reason. But I could be entirely wrong, and I could be misleading myself. But essentially, I've used the trim command, and you can see what it wants to delete. So it'll give you a preview. So would I like to delete the circle? No, I wouldn't like to. Would I like to delete the short line? And I say yes, I would. So I press enter to finish the command. So I'm going to highlight everything here. On the right hand side in properties, rather than saying it's a polyline or an arc or a circle, it says all in bracket 6. So in my hand, I have 6 elements selected. I could do the pull down menu, and in this circumstance, by coincidence, there's 3 polylines and 3 arcs. Just in case you ever select something and it says, "Oh, that's what all it's doing is it's describing this." It's in the same manner as we might talk about later in this session. When you have a block that's called chair 1 and chair 2, if you were to select both chair 1 and chair 2 together under miscellaneous, the name of the block would be called varies. I think Dom.
Yes, various. Yeah, it would say various because he doesn't understand it's more than one instance. So when you see anything in AutoCAD and it's got more than one instance of anything in it, it'll go various or varies. I think it's varies, and that's showing you've got 2 things are different, or more than 2 things are different.
Yeah.
And I think very quickly, just as you go on, explaining about closing a polyline is really good for hatches when we come on to, and I think that's where a lot of people get unstuck with hatches and filling in. So just the thought process.
Dom, it was interesting that you ran through what we're going to talk about, because they're all very much linked to one another, like you allude to. Because to do a 3D solid in comparison to a 3D mesh, you have to close a polyline, or you need to join a polyline. To do a boundary is a very similar tool from a computing process point of view as a hatch or a fill. So okay, so what I have now, we're in agreement that this is great because visually it's what we desire, but it's not. We don't want to move forward with this. So there are 2 ways. So if I just copy this to the right hand side, there are probably there's 2 that I can think of, but there's probably more. But there's 2 ways how I would solve this problem. So the reason that I would like to group this all together or join this all together is so that when I click on one element, all elements are selected. Or very much later in the process, I could turn it from a 2D drawing to a 3D drawing without any problem whatsoever. So I can use the join command. So J for join, select all the objects and press enter. And now in the top right hand corner, rather than saying all in bracket 6, it just says the word polyline with nothing in brackets. And we have automatically produced a closed polyline. Which is what we desire, but another way, and I don't know if you'd say a quicker way, Dom, just a different way. I don't. Is boundary quicker or just different?
I think it's just different. But it makes sense.
You can't do that.
No, because in making sense in AutoCAD world, when you go into hatches and it's looking for a boundary, and if your boundary is not complete, the hatch will not fill. So when we move on to hatches, it is looking for a closed boundary.
And so okay, so before we do the boundary command correctly, we can do it incorrectly. So on the left hand side, we can now delete it because we know how to change those 6 elements, 6 different elements into one element by using the join command. So I'm going to erase that. And on the right hand side, I'm going to do, that will be the correct boundary. But as Dom said here, I'm going to use the boundary command, which hopefully won't work. Fingers crossed it won't work, I suppose. So I'm going to use the boundary command. The boundary command, in my opinion, and Dom might have a different opinion, but I believe it must be that within AutoCAD, it's got to be the same thought process as hatch, because it does the same thing.
Yeah.
So I've used the boundary command. A dialog box has come up. It's asking me a question, and the question is, I need to pick an internal point of the element it wants a boundary of. So a boundary, I suppose, in our minds, we could think of a site boundary, a festival with a site boundary, and you want to determine the whole boundary of the Harris fencing or something. So this might be a circumstance for that. So I'm going to pick a point which visually is inside my object, but it's saying I can't do that. It doesn't understand that there's a hole, and it doesn't know what to do with the hole. So and visually you can clearly see in this circumstance where the hole is. But there are some circumstances where, and it was also trying to highlight, which I don't find particularly helpful because it doesn't always come up with the correct point. And one way of getting rid of that is using the regen to get rid of that. So one way we could do this, because this is a visual gap, it's really easy to know where the gap is. You could use the join command, and it says it's a polyline, but it's not closed. I'm not entirely sure it's going to do this. It might not work, but you can just literally do the pull down menu from no to yes, and it closes it, and you can see that it's produced another polyline there. But it's not very accurate because the computer is trying to determine something that one would desire to determine oneself. So I'm going to erase that. So this here, we now have our 6 objects. The boundary command is asking you for an internal point, and the internal point is there. So I now have, at a click of a button, a closed polyline of our shape, which maybe is turrets or Mickey Mouse ears on the right hand side. So hopefully that covers the boundary command.
It's very good. It's a very useful thing to talk to people about, the boundary command. And I should actually point out to everyone who thinks we may rehearse this, we don't. We talk for an hour about the week before, and then we just do it live. So when we say we don't know it's going to do it, we really don't know.
So that's the kind of thing that you might, if you've got a wacky reception area or something with carpet, that's the kind of command you'd use to turn it into an entity, kind of like a.
And so one, I know the scale for this is really, really small, but for example, this is the boundary of our space, and Dom says, oh, let's put a control area in the corner of the space, and the production manager said, well, how much carpet? So if Dom's taking up this corner in the side, how much carpet do we need to fill the rest of the space? So a quick way of doing it is the boundary command and enter. So now we still have our rectangle, which is the control area, but we also have an outline or a boundary of the area, which will be the carpet, and then the area of that, because it's a closed polyline. It'll give you the area, and then you just count back 6 decimal places to go from. Would it be called millimeter cubed, I guess? Or
millimeter cubed. But you can also, hopefully, I think if you click on it, it'll give you the chance to convert from it. So the calculator should pop up. Or no, I have Quick Calc. I know I talked about this weeks and weeks ago. I have Quick Calc, so you copy it into Quick Calc, go down to conversions at the bottom, and just convert it in area from millimeters to meters squared, because it's most people working by meter squared. So as a top tip.
Yeah, I think it would be a bit difficult sharing millimeter squared measurements. I think it might be
carpet
to turn up on side.
Big digits.
Yeah, if you want to see me looking blank in a production office, I'm usually doing carpet plans. There's many other reasons, but it's usually carpet plans and millimeter squared.
Yeah. So we might run out of time to go through all 5 points. So can I just really quickly? So we talked about the stretch command and how you can or cannot use it. Very briefly, I'll talk about the scale command. The scale command, I don't know if, Dom, you could think of specific reasons to use the scale command.
Yeah, the most normal reason is someone's received a plan from the States and you need to rescale the plan. Is the normal one.
Spoiler alert. So 2 weeks ago, we had Willis talking about video and how CADs could import into his program. Turns out that he needs them at meter scale rather than millimeter scale. So everything we sent to him was 1,000 times too big. So Tom, how do we make it our drawing into meter scale?
So the circumstance that Dom's talking about is you scale everything from by 25.4, and that's changing something from feet and inches to millimeters. And so therefore you use the scale command. You always select a base point, because otherwise it will go in a random place, especially if it's a large measurement you're changing it by. You always select a base point. So the base point is here, and in theory you can do it by hand. I can't. There's not many examples you do it by hand. There are some, but because we don't have any reference, it would be very unusual you do it by hand. So you scale it by 25.4, and you do Z enter, E enter to zoom extents, and now we have an object which was in feet and inches and now is in millimeters. So if we go back to the original, And so when you scale at something, you can put anything. You can put a below zero number in or above zero number. So the 25.4 is an above zero number. And then just off the top of your head, Dom, can you remember the scale factor to go from millimeters to feet and inches?
No.
It's
No,
some crazy number. It's 15 digits long, and it's below the zero. I always have to Google it to remember. 25.4 I can remember, but the other one I can't. So, but an easy one to answer Dick's question is, how do you change it from millimeters to meters? So you'd scale it, and it's the same. I would always recommend to use a base point. So my base point is here, and I'm going to do a 0.001. Is that enough decimal points?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I press enter, and so in this circumstance, it's a very, 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 very small object, but it'll do Z, enter, E, enter. And I suppose if I change my scale to, my visual annotation scale to 1:1, you could do, yeah, there we go. So it's 1 meter, and there will be a precision to it. So it's exactly 1 meter, which makes sense actually, because we started with a 1 meter by 2 meter rectangle, didn't we? So,
yes. Yeah. Very good.
That was number 1 of 5 points, which we might not get through, but we talked about stretching, scaling. How often do you use them, Dom?
Stretching less so, scaling on a fairly regular basis. I use scaling. It's a command everyone should get their heads around and kind of get comfortable with. And I was teaching somebody else this week, and it goes back to the PDF conversations we're having about importing a PDF. And kindly, the hotel PDF had a line on 8 meters. And so we then used that as our reference. So we scaled it, used that 8 meters to give us a starting plan, basically, for him to take on a site survey. So that makes sense.
An unbelievably useful tool, and it probably helped that person go on the site visit massively to have that before they went, I guess.
Yes, yeah, it was. And it was a proper kind of dawning moment for them. It was like, okay, so we know that line is accurate, so we can then work out everything else off that. So
just while Don was going through that incredibly useful information, which have we covered that in a lesson? If not, we can cover it in maybe another week's. But have we converted a PDF to DWG lesson? I can't remember.
Yes, you did it for me.
You have, yes.
Yeah, we had a really good one based on the Metropole NEC.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Where you unpicked it and showed us. That was one of our very best, I think.
Yeah. We are moving on to the second subject, which I think is hatches.
Hatches and fills.
Yeah, hatches and fills. So what we have here is just to continue what we were talking about earlier. We'll have a rectangle that's going across the page and a rectangle that's going down the page. And I would like to fill these objects or hatch these objects to tell a story. So often, like Don was saying, the story with hatches could be carpet. That's a really, really good example to use a hatch, because you might not necessarily know the color of the carpet exactly, but you need to have contrasting colors. So when somebody holds it up in front of them, they're like, oh, the magenta color means something, or the green color means something. Another example would be when you're doing a section through an object, through an item, and you might like to produce a transparent hatch within the wall cavity to emphasize that the wall cavity is there. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to do a new layer, which is going to be called hatch. I'll just change the color in this circumstance. And how you bring the hatch command up is you type in hatch. And by default, I believe, especially on my machine, it wants me to select an object rather than, in comparison to when you do the boundary command, by default, it wants to select, wants you to pick inside the object. So if you desire to change that, you just need to change it from selection, which is by default, to pick point. So pick point, I'm just going to quickly do this, and we now have a hatch or a fill or a pattern, or you can call it different objects, different things. So a really nice one to produce a really obvious reason of not going in this area could be a 45-degree hatch. at a different scale. So what this is, we have a boundary around the outside, which is still it's still a rectangle, but within it we have a hatch which says please don't go in this area because it's a fire exit, for example. Because it's a hatch which has been produced from a boundary of a polyline in comparison to a boundary of a spline, you should be able to get from the geometry, you should be able to get the area from it. So therefore, if somebody asks what this no-go area is, you could say it's so many square meters. So if I was to select the hatch command again, and on the before doing anything on the top ribbon, it gives me loads of different options. One of the options is solid. So solid is purely a solid color. It could be described as fill, in the same manner as a hatch could be described as a fill, but visually it doesn't necessarily give you the indication because it's literally a hatch, which you might do when you're drawing by hand. But a fill is literally like you would in Microsoft Paint or something. You're filling a color, or Photoshop, you fill a color within a boundary. So in this circumstance, I've done a solid hatch pattern, and I've picked the point, and the pick point is here. So they're both deemed, I believe, yes, if I select both of them, yeah, they're both deemed as a hatch, but visually a hatch can be anything you desire. So in this circumstance, it's some multiple lines at a 45-degree angle, and in this circumstance, it's a solid fill. The reason that, if I delete this object here, the reason that I would use the pick point in comparison to the select, if I do the select, just select one object, it doesn't do what I desire. You can, and I don't know if it's going to work, if I do the hatch command, I can select multiple objects and it might do what I desire, but it's not, yeah, it's not really doing what I desire. So which is more often than not, I would try my best to use the pick point. Dom, I don't know, do you have a preference, or do you have a way of
pick point, unless it's a single thing, it's pick point, because then you know where it's going, and you don't have to go back and do it again. I think it'd be also very good just now to just talk about transparencies and hatches. And Dick was asking when we were chatting before, why use hatches? I use hatches an awful lot in arenas to mark out camera positions and seat kills. So wherever we've got seat kills, is a really easy way of creating a PDF and sending it to the venue and saying, these are the seats we're going to kill in your venue, please don't sell them. But you can also do the fill, I think Tom's just getting ready for it, to show something below it. So if you were going to a fire meeting or something like that and you wanted to talk about a certain fire exit, you could have your plan underneath, put a fill on top, create a transparency for it, and Tom is just getting there very cleverly, and be able to show in a very clear way on a PDF. And we keep talking about the story, so people can't misunderstand the story, and this is a very good way of showing the story. I'll let you carry on.
Thank you so much. So Dom is entirely correct. So apart from carpet plans, almost every single job you do is seat kills. So seat kills, whether it's a removal of a seat, or whether it's a steel deck built over a seat, or whether it's an area of seating that can't be sold, or that nobody can see anything from. So you desire to produce a story or tell the client, and therefore, or the venue first and then the client, hang on a minute, there's going to be a few less seats in this arena. Technically, the drawing on the left-hand side is telling us exactly the same as the drawing on the right-hand side. We've gone to produce an A3 layout of it, and we print this out, and Dom says, that's fantastic, but I don't know what it's telling me. And I say, oh, yes, of course you do, because underneath here are some seats. So it's technically correct because everything's there, but the visual style or how you're presenting to someone isn't quite ready to be sent to the client. One way of doing it is doing a transparency to the hatch. So on the left-hand side and the right-hand side is telling us identical information, but we have set the transparency to the hatch to be 75% transparent, so you can see what's underneath the hatch. So in this circumstance, I can say to Dom, yeah, there's this area that's 1 meter by 1 meter, and that area have got 3 seats in. Please take them off sale. So a transparency can be done on anything, but it's most likely to be done on a hatch. So if I desire, I could change this transparency to 50%, so it dies down a bit. I could also do another thing. So I could use a command called hatch to back. So the left-hand side and the right-hand side are telling us identical things, but because the color 10, I believe I chose for this hatch, is so prominent, it's a little bit hard to see what those chairs are in between in this area. So therefore, a transparency is a great way of just knocking back the color slightly in a quick manner that makes what you're trying to tell an easier story to understand.
So one of the things that I get, and I'll see big plans with, particularly for space allocation, people will hatch out, designers will hatch out areas and say that's the space allocated to this. The problem that I have is that they get in the way. How do you get rid of them? Are they should they be on their own layers? How do you get rid of them?
If possible, they could be on their own layer. So in this circumstance, I could select one object. I go to my home ribbon. I isolate that one layer. I select those objects and E for areas, enter, and then unisolate and bring it back. In the circumstance you're talking about, there's a potential, and it's no fault of anyone, but there's a potential that the hatch is done on different layers or not done on any layer at all, so 0 for example, and the color has been changed. So you could use the filter command to select an object. So a filter is you can select any type of object within AutoCAD, a 3D solid, a polyline, a circle, a line, or a hatch. You can go in the pull down menu, type H for hatch, and press enter, and you do. Did that work? No. What have I done wrong? Oh, add to list. Sorry, I've forgotten how to use the feature. sorry.
Finally, 12 weeks in.
Oh dear. So you do hatch and you do add to list and apply. And I select this object here, and in this circumstance, I've got 4 hatches, which we know because we've drawn them ourselves, but they're only hatched, so there's nothing else is selected. I could use the move command and move it a known measurement away temporarily, and I suppose in your circumstance, Dick, what I might do, because I might not necessarily want to delete it immediately, because the client might say, oh, actually, no, the area you have is not the light blue, it's the dark gray. And you're like, oh gosh, where was the dark gray? I've deleted it. Yeah. So you might like to override the drawing or improve the drawing for your circumstance, not improve from the original, but nonetheless, in your use of the drawing, you might want to improve it slightly. And one way of improving in that circumstance specifically is you could change the layer of the hatch. So I don't have a layer set up, but you could do that, move it back by 2.5 meters, and then you could use the freeze command and freeze the hatch.
So, and I think filter we haven't heard at all, doesn't ring any bells. Where does filter come in?
A filter comes in when you have a drawing which has been changed from a PDF to a DWG using the automatic program, where you receive a DWG which is exported from Vectorworks, where you have a DWG which is drawn in a manner which might not necessarily be ideal, and you need to select a few objects out of it and do exactly what we talked about and say, select the hatch and put it on the hatch layer, select the solid and put it on the solid layer. That's how I'd use the filter command.
I think also it's worth noting the transparencies, and Dick, to answer your question, if you receive a big plan and there's hatches all over it, if you can get them all on one layer, what you can also do is give a layer of transparency as well. Yeah. So you could get all your hatches on one layer, and instead of having to do a transparency on all of them, you can just apply a transparency to that entire layer, knock that layer back, so you can still see what's going on, but you've still got the information the hatch is there. There's also something I do quite a lot. If I receive a drawing that's really, really busy, it's a venue, there's exhibition stands, there's carpets, I'll tend to knock back a lot of the layers so I can actually see what I'm doing. I've still got the information there with me, but knock them back in the transparency, and it's still there in the drawing, but makes life a lot easier to see what's going on.
Discovered this myself. There's an ability to, and Tom, you touched on it there, of sending layers backwards so that a la PowerPoint, so that you see other stuff on top of it rather than underneath it.
Yes, so you can do it manually. So you can click on anything and right click and then draw order, and you can, like you would in yeah, almost any program. Photoshop, I suppose, springs to mind. But yeah, where is it? At the top and the middle, at the bottom. But a very nice command that I think there's two different commands that do the same thing is a hatch to back. So it will send all hatches to back, and I think also there's text to back. I'm sorry, yeah, text to front. Sorry, that would make sense, wouldn't it? Yeah, text to front. So hatch to back and then text to front are really useful tools. Again, if you have a drawing that has to be quickly manipulated and you don't know anything about it, there's a few quick commands that you might like to do, just so that when you print it for the production manager who's running out the door, is potentially more likely to be readable. So it's less likely that the text is underneath the hatch, etc.
Yeah.
Cool. Does that give you enough information on hatches, Dick? Because that was your big question this week.
Yeah. No, that's really good. That's just what I wanted.
And I think between that and understanding closing polylines and stuff like that allows people to do hatches. More often than not, I'll get a drawing. Someone says, I can't make a hatch work. And it really is as simple as the polyline hasn't been closed, and CAD won't do it.
Yeah. Don, would you be able to so kind to remind me of the next subject?
Yeah, next subject is dynamic blocks. Dick just asked for a quick refresh on dynamic blocks again.
It was particularly about how to create them. It's one of those things that you showed us, particularly with your steel decks and variable legs, and it's something that my version of DraftSight doesn't accommodate. But I don't know that, going back, that you ever showed us how to actually create one in the first place, as opposed to a standard block.
Okay, fantastic. So that's a good segue, and I've drawn a very basic steel deck. So sorry, I don't have a steel deck with me. So I have a steel deck with no known measurements, which is not ideal, but nonetheless. So that's a fascinating question, Dick. So I believe, and Dom, please interrupt if you don't agree or you have a different thought process on it. I believe a block and a dynamic block has the same starting point.
Yes. Yeah. Agreed.
So if you're able to produce a block, you're halfway there to produce a dynamic block. So in this circumstance, I would like to do a section of a deck. I've selected the block command, which has brought up this dialog box. I've named it something. If at all possible, it's always nice to name block something. You don't have to, but it's really, really convenient to do it, so that, because in the same way as a printed drawing ideally would tell a story, in an ideal scenario, if I'm not working on a job anymore and Dom is now moving on to it, it would be really handy if Dom was to click on something and he could be told instantaneously what it is, even if it doesn't look like a section of a steel deck.
I use this naming thing, talking to somebody, Dickie, earlier in the week, and it is really important. So my example is chairs. So a lot of the time I will bring chairs into the drawing. I expect you do too, to set up a drawing, and then we get a few weeks down and the lovely people come and say, actually, using this chair from this rental company, it's called this. So for argument's sake, I may have something that's called a chair XYZ, or chair 1 simply, and their chair is called chair 1. When you bring their chair 1 into AutoCAD, it goes, well, I know about chair 1, I'm not going to import it. Yeah. So we talked about the rename command, I think. So then I'd go back and rename the chair. What's really important, if I'd called my chair in the first place PLX chair 1, it would have been different. It would have gone straight in. So actually naming blocks and drawings and styles and everything like that is really important. And it's really good, as Tom says, if you're taking over a drawing, you can instantly see where somebody's been and what it all is, from line styles, dim styles, blocks, everything. And giving your annotation of DC for Dick Crab, I use PLX and all my stuff, just allows people. And then if you've got a problem, we were talking about this in the first hour, you can find the person and go, hang on, I'm not understanding this properly, because it has got their information with it. So.
And it's a scenario that I come across sometimes, Don, when I'm taking over a job, and I'll be starting a job and the producer will come and sit with me and say, oh, just talk me through this. And I might have been in the first few hours of ever seeing this drawing. And the producer will say, well, what's that? And I click on it, and in my mind, I'm thinking, I have absolutely no idea.
I know this feeling. It's a click of death. What does this do?
And the producer, quite rightly, will emphasize, well, you should know. And I in my mind, I'm thinking, yes, I should definitely know. So that's a reason that wherever possible, if possible, please use layers that mean something. They don't have to be terribly fancy, but mean something. And I think more importantly, block names that mean something as well.
Yeah, because CAD will give it some random and letter number combination if you don't name it, and it will mean absolutely nothing to anybody. So.
Exactly. So a quick demonstration of this is, so I know, I'm sorry, it doesn't look like a steel deck, but we all know it's a steel deck in this circumstance for the argument of this. But so therefore I have two steel decks, and I can do Control X and Control Shift V, and I now have a block which visually looks identical, and we know it's a steel deck, but it's called $C3, etc. And that doesn't mean anything to anyone.
And you got 100 of those in a list, you get very upset very quickly.
Yeah. And you can, if there are hundreds, you can nibble away at things that, if there's an array of rows and rows of elements which are 500 millimeter wide and a meter away from one another, it's a row of chairs. But you get to the point where you get from 100 down to 10, and you really like, I'm so sorry, I really don't know what those last 10 items are.
Yeah.
So I have a block which is called a section deck, sorry. It's 500 millimeters high, and so we could in theory finish at this point because this is a block. But the question specifically is, how do you produce a dynamic block? So the way of producing a dynamic block is to produce a block. I go to the block editor, and you can see that the background is slightly different, so it's taking me into a different space. It does everything similar, but it's taking it to a different space. If you'd like to change the background, just do right click and change the color. I would like to add a parameter to this. So with steel deck, often one parameter that's relatively easy to manipulate is the height of the legs. So in this circumstance, I'm going to change the height of the legs. I add a parameter in. I would like to add a action to that parameter. And in this circumstance, we talked about earlier, I'd like to add a stretch parameter to the, stretch action to the parameter. Sorry about getting all the names mixed around. So asking me to select a parameter. This is where I might not necessarily do it in the correct order, but the end process should be correct. That's the object I would like to pull down on. I would like to stretch, like we did with the stretch command. In this circumstance, rather than an invisible box, there's a real box. And within that box, I'd like to select those objects. I press enter, and you can see so if I do a new parameter, that parameter there is a distance 2, but it doesn't do anything. And the reason we know it doesn't do anything is that it doesn't have an action next to it. So I'm going to erase that. So we now know there's an action, and the action is stretch. Close the block editor, say yes to save it. And you can see, so we have our insertion point, which is shown by a blue square, and we have a parameter which is shown by a down arrow, and I can stretch that to my heart's content. I can change the measurement in the properties on the right hand side. I can go back into it, and I can change it from a consistent measurement or an endless measurement. I can change the value set from none, which it was because you could set it to anything you desire, to a list. Would you use a list? I don't think you'd use a list in this circumstance because you don't know where you would want to go up to, but you might use an increment. And I think we were talking the other day, or a couple of weeks ago, sorry, when we were doing this, is you might have 6 inches or 150 millimeter increments of legs.
Yeah. So this screen with the grey background, it's called is called a what? Because that's the bit that I have no access to in my cheap program.
It's called a block editor.
Block editor. Thank you.
Yeah. And there's 2 ways of editing a block. There's edit block in place, or there's a block editor. I believe the edit block in place is useful for so many tools, but it's not useful for the parameters with the annotation or attributes we're talking about at this stage.
Yeah, that's brilliant, because that's the bit I think we just jumped over a little too quickly when you were doing the steel decks for real the other week.
Yes. So now we have a steel deck that is currently at 500 millimeters high, or we're hoping it is, but we desire to increase it by a foot or 300 millimeters. So now all we do is drag those down. I think we had this problem last time, didn't we? It's really frustrating that it says 801.8694.
Yes, you got very cross about the whole subject.
Yeah, I can't. John, what did I do wrong? I must have done something wrong. I can't remember.
We found your weakness.
I know. So anyway, so we've gone from 500. Let's pretend between ourselves that's 500 millimeters, and we can increase it to 800 millimeters because that's 1 foot or 300 millimeters higher. So that is how you produce a block with attributes.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well done.
Thank you,
Yeah.
And it's worth mentioning, you talked about editing block in place, which you can do. It'll open up a block and it won't go through to the screen Tom just showed us. It just allows you to edit it live on the drawing itself. And then what you must remember is to save that part and not just click back out again, otherwise your work won't be saved. So the ribbon bar will change at the top, do your work from editing in place, and then just save your way out of it. And it's useful if you're going through XREFs and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I'm fairly certain, Dom, this warning is warning me, do not under any circumstance do what I'm about to do, because the height measurements, you're going to ruin the height measurements. So basically, so in theory at this point you just press cancel and cancel, and then to edit it you do right click a block editor and you go back to there.
Or edit on the keyboard.
Yeah, sorry, of course. Yeah, there's so many different ways. Or double clicking, can you do that?
Double click, you're good.
Yeah. So there's lots of different ways.
And
So does that answer the question?
Yes. No, I think that filled in certainly the bit that I missed. So
fantastic.
That's good.
So
cool.
The next subject.
Our next subject is amending blocks and in multiple instances. So I think we just talked about editing very quickly, but what's the multiple instances, Dick? This is your question.
So this is, I think, somewhere along the lines you had talked about, probably in the instance of lamps, or in my case of loudspeakers. The hire company says, I know you've put on that it's E8s. I haven't got any of them. Can we replace it with the L Acoustics 12LX?
Okay,
or whatever?
block replace. Yeah, block replace, basically. Okay.
So I think because I'm just trying to do this a bit quick, I'm going to use chairs rather than lighting.
Yeah.
That's okay.
They look like lights as well.
Oh, yeah, it's a Parkan, isn't it? Almost.
Yeah, exactly.
So what we have is a plan view of 3 rows of chairs. There are 21 elements, so I presume there's 7 in each row. They are called chair 1, which is for the circumstances fine. Ideally, you would be a bit more descriptive, but I suppose at this point when we produced this drawing, we didn't know anything more than that. But what has just been decided is we are going to move the stage from one side to the other. So where you can, sorry, this is not necessarily editing multiple blocks, but it's useful to know that you could rotate all of these by 180 degrees and the stage is suddenly above us. But where it might be more useful, and I think Don might have mentioned it earlier in the conversation, is where you have chair manufacturer change, where you change from one chair manufacturer to another, or the size of an object, or we want to change it from 500 millimeters wide to 650 millimeters wide. Of course we can fit the same number of people in the venue, can't we? Which is no often, but it's a good example of how am I going to make this slightly different. Okay, I'm going to make it slightly different by using the boundary command, and I'm going to say chair 2, and I'm going to do pick point, and I'm going to select the object. And so this is a scenario where edit block in place is perfectly acceptable and a very, very good and easy way of doing this. So we have, if I do right click select similar, we have 21 objects of chair 1. I would like to change chair 1, edit block in place, to chair 2. I'd like to delete the closed polyline within chair 1. I'd like to click on the very, very light grayed out color of chair 2, and I'd like to add it to the working set. And I'd like to do save changes. So what we have now is if we do select similar, we have 21 instances of chair 1, and we're like, oh, that's not right, is it? So what we need to do now is do the explode command once, and we do select similar again, and we have 21 instances of chair 2. So without doing much work, we have proven or disproven, whichever what you're trying to prove or disprove, that it doesn't work in this circumstance of using chair 2. Ideally, let's move back to chair 1 in a very, very quick way of doing it. So that's how one would change one block to another block in a quick way.
And you could do that, for example, say throughout the entire multi-breakout FIRA. You could change every single so Dominic puts in chair 1 just as a holding chair, and then we discover the real size of the actual chairs. You could change every single chair in every instance across the entire venue. Exactly,
but yeah, 100% you could, which sometimes a little bit dangerous. So let's go back to chair 1. So we know we've done a holding pattern of chair 1 in this room, in this room, that room, and that room. And the producer of this, let's call this room 1, the producer of room 1 had said, I would like to have a different size chair because this is VIP potentially or something like that. And so, yes, you could, but if you edited it to VIP for a room 1, it would change for room 2 and room 3. So I can explain how I would go around this, and Dom might have a different way of doing it. So in this circumstance, I would do Control X to take VIP room 1 away from this drawing, do new drawing, a blank template, go to model space, go to edit, paste to original coordinates, Z enter, E enter, rename command, find chair 1, and I'd like to chair VIP. I now have in my hand 21 instances of a block called chair VIP, even though visually is identical to chair 1. We do Control X and then edit. Ooh, is that going to work? Edit, paste original coordinates. And so what I can do now is visually they're identical. We can change that in a second. Do select similar, but you can see that room 2 and 3 are the only ones in your hand. Then there's 42 instances of those elements in your hand, and I do select similar in room 1, and I have 21 instances of VIP chairs. Dom, would you do something similar to that?
Yeah, I'd do something very, very similar to that. Yeah, and it all goes back to naming things and rename. Actually, you've shown the rename command is a really, really useful thing to show people. Someone was going through again this week how to rename blocks and anything. So
yeah, and so Dick, it might not necessarily work in a sound or audio circumstance, but in a chair or table or set element, that's quite a good way, because quite rightly, when you're first working on a project that's 4 months away, you would do holding positions of a stage or a chair or something, and so that's a quick way of taking what is now deemed as a VIP room out and then quickly editing it.
I mean, this is going to be my lesson for this week of being able to go off and pick out individual loudspeakers all over the plan and change them en masse. That's going to save me an awful lot of work.
Just had to look it up because there's a command. I remember it's block replace, which I have used in the past, and I think it's under Express Tools. So I don't know if you'll get it in draft site, Dick, but under Express Tools, there's block replace, which should literally swap one block.
Yeah, that's a clever one.
Yeah, it should swap one block to another. But again, as Tom says, it's dangerous because you have to go back, and it's all right if you've got a bunch of lights and you're swapping a source for 26 degrees for a source for 19 degrees. The body's pretty much the same size. But if you do a whole lot of chairs, you're going to have to go back through the rooms and check you haven't got overlays and things like that.
Yeah.
But it'd be worth actually us talking about draft site if it's got an Express Tools section. Block replace does work.
And there's a really powerful tool in Design Center, which I have to talk about a different time, but it's how you update a block from a different drawing. I find I use it all the time.
Yeah, a Design Center somewhere had open continuously. It saves so much time.
I think we've just found ourselves a new topic, because that's another one that I've never heard of before.
Keep note, Dick. Keep note.
John, from memory, I think there's one more. Shall I try and cover it quickly, or?
What are we doing? We're coming up to just an hour. How are we doing? We can do another. We've been since Dave left us. Since Dave's left us, we've been rocking up the hour every week. So it's all good in my world. 3D solids versus 3D meshes was a question of Dick when he was building his room at the Metropole.
Yeah, so last week, Tom, you particularly talked about how AutoCAD got upset in 3D, and I forget which way round it was, between solids, meshes, and so this is for me. I'm creating my loudspeakers now in 3D. So I'm creating a trapezoidal bottom, copying it up on the Z-axis to a trapezoidal top, and then linking the four corners, creating that as my block. As against the first time I did it, just create the trapezoidal box and extrude the thing upwards and create the block as that. Is there any, what's the downfall that you were talking about that AutoCAD doesn't like? And is there any, this is a very personal one, is there a pluses and minuses for me?
So, Dom, again, are very welcome to have a different opinion, but I believe that AutoCAD works best in 3D solids. You can draw a mesh and you can draw 3D faces. I'm going to get my names confused, but you can draw a 3D solid of an item or a mesh of an item that will look visually identical, and they will be technically correct because they're the same measurement. But especially the tool which is view-based in relatively new versions of AutoCAD will only display a 3D solid until it doesn't, because that's a region. Okay, so what I was trying to skip the process slightly. So what I did here is I did a 3D solid, and the reason we know it's a 3D solid is because it's a closed polyline. You extrude it to a measurement, and then in this circumstance, I unioned 4 elements together. Those 4 elements is deemed as one 3D solid. I pulled it to one side. I exploded. I used the explode command once to make it a region, and I thought I was going to tell a different story, but I'm going to temporarily explode it twice. So am I going to get anything? It's not ideal. I'm going to do this slightly different. I'm going to do a polyline which on purpose is not closed, and that closed itself, which is not very helpful. So I'm going to do a polyline which is not closed, which I can do shift middle wheel, extrude. I can still extrude it, and I can do a visual style. Visually, it looks like a surface, but it's not going to be viewable. It is, isn't it? Okay, another way of doing it is you can't slice. So slicing something is a good way of editing in AutoCAD. So I have now sliced that 3D solid, and it produced a solid within it. But I haven't done this very well, so we might need to run through it at a different time. But essentially, 3D solids are the best way. But of course, 3D meshes is a very, very good way of making an organic shape. So anything you get from Rhino or you get from any other kind of 3D program is almost definitely going to be a 3D mesh, and that's where you have a difficulty in visually using the 3D base point, or the base view, sorry, to visually do a representation of it. So in that circumstance, you need to do a viewport, and you'd have to do a double click inside the viewport and change from custom view to a front view, and then you double click outside it and you do another new viewport, and you double click inside it and you do top, and then you double click outside it, and then you have to line these two up. That's how you would have to do it if you were doing a mesh that would come in from Rhino, for example.
Okay.
Help at all, Dick?
Yeah. Do you know what? I don't know is the answer.
Well, to be honest with you, I probably haven't explained it very well, and I might need to come back to it and I might need to set something up a bit better to explain it a bit better. But if at all possible, draw things in. If you're doing 3D in AutoCAD, if at all possible, do it in 3D solids. and maybe next week or another week I can have something set up to try and explain it a little bit better.
I think the nub of it is, because mine is the budget program, that it doesn't support 3D solids. So therefore, everything that I'm creating in 3D is a workaround. So does extruding upwards give me a better result, or just creating a polygon in 3 dimensions give me the same thing?
I personally would always start in 2D.
Yeah.
Drawing a rectangle, which is a closed polyline, and extrude it.
So I should be extruding it.
Yeah.
Yeah, as long as it's a closed polyline, because if I were to go back a few steps and if I was to explode the polyline, which is now a line, I could still extrude it, but it would be 4 extrusions rather than 1. So it would give the same idea, but this is a surface, and it's not quite. It's correct because it's the correct measurements and it's the correct height, but it's not as easy to change in a future. It's not as easy to cut 250 millimeters off it, or make a radius around the edges, or make a hole through the center for a bolt hole or something like that.
Okay. Cool.
So I think possibly we come back to that, and it is in 3D modeling, and I do most of mine in Vectorworks, as people know. It's exactly the same. You extrude everything as a solid and then work from there, and it becomes ultimately much more editable in the long run. As soon as you don't, the editing time and the you want to subtract or add from a solid, you want to join 2 together, or as Tom says, you want to put a hole through it or something like that, it becomes a lot easier if it's a solid and it's understood as a solid in the first place. So Dick, what's our list for next week so people know?
Well, I think you had offered, and I think Cookie South has come up a couple of times, it'd be really interesting to hear the production electrician's perspective, and I think I could learn an awful lot, because lighting is so much further down this workflow than sound ever is. And hopefully Willis and I will have got to the bottom of his imports and exports, and he might come back and show us some prettiness. Those are the things to me that spring to mind.
Brilliant. I will summon Cookie South, so everyone knows. We'll summon Cookie South and talk production electrics next week, and how and this is a bit like when Dick joined us in the first place, how he interacts with plans that Tom and I generate, and he works generally for lighting designers, so they've given him a lighting plan with lights on, and then what he does with it to extract information, and possibly tie that in reporting as well, because lighting does an awful lot of reporting. And I'll bring some trust to the game and show how to trust reports, and so you know your lengths in the drawing.
Brilliant. I think that's going to be a really practical one, real world stuff.
Brilliant. Well, another amazing week, Tom. Absolutely amazing by you. Full stop.
Yeah,
really well done. As I say
Well
to people, we don't rehearse this. We just turn up and do it every single week. We could rehearse it for the hour, but we like talking to each other for the hour before, and we all just turn up and do it. So, Tom, amazing effort by you. Dick, thank you for going back through everything and researching the questions, and hopefully helping people understand the bits we said, yeah, we'll do that later, and haven't come back to. So we will see you all next week. And have a very safe week, everybody. And look forward to seeing you and speaking to you soon. Bye-bye.